Okay, so today the Pondering Tree Sutta, and this is a sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya, which is one of the collections of the smaller suttas, less famous suttas. You all know what a sutta is? You know what a sutta is, more or less? Okay. So, when the Buddha was even teaching, people would record what he said by means of recitation. So he would say something and then they would boil it down into an essence of what he said, and then would formalize that into a formula that then could get recited. The recitations then started during the Buddha's lifetime, but after he died, there was a gathering of monks who wanted to check on what he'd actually taught and formalize these teachings. So there were certain collection points, and anybody who'd heard a teaching from the Buddha would go to a collection point and report what they had heard, and presumably it gets fitted into the formulas. By formulas you mean things like how many kinds of feeling are there, liking and disliking, or liking, disliking and neutral, or liking from things that you see, things that you smell, things that you taste. So then there would be 6 kinds of liking. There's also 5 kinds of liking. Liking physically, not liking physically, liking mentally, not liking mentally, and neutral feeling. So there are different ways to categorize things. So these then would get collected and formalized and then recited. And the recitation tradition was considered the strongest form of record keeping. 3 forms of record keeping: storytelling, recitation, and writing. And writing can also include sculpture. The writing was very difficult to do. Not so many people could read. It was very slow, hard to maintain. Writing is subject to fire, flood, mold, etc. And also written word is subject to revision. It's quite important that people can come along afterwards and say, you know, the Buddha said this, but I don't think he really should have said that, so make a few changes. And they say in Christianity that Jesus taught about reincarnation, but Constantine removed it from the teachings. May or may not be true, but it does present that fact that when things are written down, you can never be sure if it's actually original. Another thing that happens is mistakes get into written word. So while you're copying something, you make a mistake, and then that mistake gets copied into subsequent works, and so the mistakes can spread through. I have a little joke about that. The Christian monks who were talking about this, and they figured if they want to know what Jesus really said, that they should, you know this joke, that they should look into the original scriptures, because mistakes may have been made. So one of them goes down and he doesn't come into the cellars to find the original scriptures. And then a few days later he hasn't come back up, so they go and find him, and he's there crying in the cellar where all the original scriptures are. And they say, what's the matter? And he said, oh, Jesus told us to celebrate, not celibate. So mistakes can get copied. When you're reciting something, very difficult to make changes. He and I could probably recite the Dhammacakka Sutta pretty much in harmony, even coming from different countries with different accents, but we both know it word for word. Pretty good, right? So if I was to try and change it, he would know that I'd changed it. And if thousands of people have all recited something, then we know that one person can't make any changes to it. Interestingly, the Buddhist scriptures were only written down when there weren't enough monks to maintain the recitation. This was in Sri Lanka with Buddha Gosa, Indian monk who lived in Sri Lanka. And he was the one that formalized and wrote down all the texts that we have today. But that was only because this school of Buddhism had declined so far that it was in danger of becoming extinct. So that's what a sutta is. It's a teaching of the Buddha that has been recorded by recitation. Now, of course, it's all on the internet and CD-ROMs and things. So those are as close as we can get to the original word of the Buddha. And even there are Mahayana texts and Vajrayana texts, but historically these are all much later teachings. So the Theravada texts, or the Pali texts, are considered to be the closest that we have to the actual word of the Buddha. So that's what we go back to when we want to find out about what the teachings were. We always have this problem that we can agree on what was said, but then we disagree on what was meant by what was said. So the Buddha might say something, and now we're like, well, what did he mean by that? Did you ever see the Life of Brian? The movie Life of Brian? No? You have to see the Life of Brian. You've seen the Life of Brian? Yeah. In the Life of Brian, Jesus is on the Mount doing the Sermon of the Mount, and he said, "Blessed are the cheesemakers." And then the guy at the back's going, "What's so special about cheesemakers?" And someone else says, "Well, I don't think he means cheesemakers. I think he means purveyors of all dairy produce." So we have this problem that we can agree on what was said, but what was meant by what was said? So actually after the suttas you had commentaries where later teachers said this is what he meant when he said that. And so then there were commentaries on the commentaries. This is what the commentator meant when he said that that's what the original meant, and so on and so forth. So actually Theravada school I like to separate from Pali. Pali is the original teachings, as close as we can get. Whereas Theravada is a school of interpretation on those teachings. That's one of the three main schools of Buddhism. So that's where the teachings come from. And the clarity, the way that the Buddha would teach, our Buddha, was in a way of what was called Vaibhajavadin, or the way of analysis. And what that means is the vehicle or the means to finding enlightenment was through analysing your experience or understanding your experience. We'll come to what enlightenment means shortly. There were different, in the Buddhist legend, or myth, if you like, there were three kinds of Buddha. There's a faith-based Buddha, there is a wisdom-based Buddha, and there is a heroic struggle Buddha. So, a Buddha is one who has become perfectly enlightened, fully enlightened. And his vehicle for getting enlightened can vary. So the lowest one is a faith-based one. He gets enlightened through what in India now is called bhakti yoga, right? It's a way of surrender. Surrender to God or universe, whatever, Dharma. The second level is a wisdom-based Buddha, and that's what Shakyamuni was. Our Buddha was a wisdom-based Buddha. But the best one is a heroic struggle Buddha. And the next Buddha that will come, Maitreya, is supposed to be a Buddha of heroic struggle. And where Shakyamuni had 10 disciples, Maitreya Buddha will have 1,000 disciples. So he's going to have a much greater range, for enlightening beings. I think that's because when Maitreya Buddha comes, they will have YouTube and internet, and that just makes it easier to get your message out. This is legend, so I mean, we don't have to take it too seriously, but it does present the idea that people were thinking about Like, well, how does somebody get enlightened? And what does that mean for their ability and skill in teaching? So, our Buddha was a wisdom-based Buddha, and that means that we get to enlightenment through understanding our experience. I don't know what heroic struggle is going to be. I kind of fancy wisdom more than I fancy heroically struggling. That doesn't... and so what we end up with is these very highly technical breakdowns of experience and how to understand that experience and how that understanding is going to take you to enlightenment. Briefly on enlightenment, we're going to give a definition that within human experience or animals' experience, there is a certain quality. This quality was called the amata, or deathless, and the discovery of the great yogis was to find this deathless thing. Now, deathless means, you could translate as immortality, but it doesn't mean that you are immortal. It means that something within your experience is immortal or deathless, or is always there, even if you live and you die, or you're reborn or not reborn. That core consciousness, if you want to call it that way, spark is still there. Interestingly, the people that have discovered this amata, this enlightenment, they would say that the amata is the big thing, and you are the little spark that's come up, hot for a while, and then you're going to fizzle out and die. So, for one who is enlightened, they would look at you as the small temporary interference in this. Whereas from our perspective, we would have to say we're going to have to find this small spark within our experience. Does that make sense? So, that thing that the saints and sages have discovered is what we call enlightenment. There are many different words for it. Amata. Mata means death, and amata means without death. It was called the goal, it was called nibbana or nirvana, not to be confused with the rock group. Nibbana, which means, usually they translate as a blowing out. Nibbana means to blow out, and the idea is to blow out greed, hatred and delusion. Something like that. But there are many words for nibbana, for this goal or enlightenment. One of the words that Buddha used, in fact, was asangata, and this means unconditioned. Unconditioned. So the idea being that any state of mind that you can find is a state of mind that's come up, it's going to last for a while, and it's going to disappear. So we call that state of mind conditioned, because it has arisen due to certain conditions being in place. And it will disappear also when those conditions no longer apply. So, you're eating your favourite food. For me as an Englishman, it would probably be fish and chips with pickled onions. I think I need Vegemite on it as well. And that creates a very blissful state of mind. That blissful state of mind has arisen due to certain conditions. I have a healthy body, I have a healthy appetite, and I have fish and chips. It was actually Bondi Beach. I was going to go this morning. I've been looking forward all year to my fish and chips on Bondi Beach. They have an English fish and chip shop. Mushy peas, pickled onions, vinegar. It was a bit cold this morning. We had no electricity. So, whatever state of mind it is that you can attain to is a state of mind that has arisen dependent on conditions. Also, unhappy states of mind. If you have dropped something on your toe, and your toe is hurting, and you're in an unhappy condition, state of mind, that also has just arisen, and the unhappiness is dependent on your toe, and that too will disappear eventually. So any state of mind is always dependent on certain conditions. So what is this attainment that has no conditions, that doesn't have any conditions that it depends on? So for example, if you're sitting in meditation and everything becomes very blissful, which happens from time to time, not very often, but can happen, and you think, yeah, that must be it, there must be, I must be getting to enlightenment. But that practice has depended upon your meditation, upon focusing your mind usually onto something that is going to elicit a happy or blissful feeling. So if you focus your mind right now onto Donald Trump, you're going to get an unhappy feeling will arise, presumably, unless you like him, which people do. He's very popular in the monks, actually. I did a survey in our university, and a lot of the monks quite like him. He has very effective PR, even if you don't like him. If you focus your mind onto something pleasant, then your mind will start to become pleasant. So if you focus your mind onto fluffy kittens, and you think about fluffy kittens, then your mind will start to become happy. The mind will follow your attention, presuming that you like fluffy kittens. If you don't like fluffy kittens, you don't deserve enlightenment. Anyway. I was in this restaurant yesterday, the day before, and I was playing, we were having a coffee, and I was playing with this guy's dog, and he said, this dog rolls over, so I'm tickling its tummy. And the guy said, yeah, he loves having his tummy rubbed. I said, yes, so do I. I like to tell jokes like that, seriously, and then walk off. I said, yes, so do I. Anyway, it was nice to meet you. And they were like, oh, yeah, it's nice to meet you. They're like, they're sure something weird just happened. So whatever you focus your mind onto, your mind's going to start taking on that characteristic. This is just the way that the mind works when we analyze it. You put your mind onto something that you like, you start to get jazzed up and you get a pleasant feeling. You put your mind onto things that you don't like, then your mind's going to lapse into suffering. If you put your mind onto something neutral that you don't like or dislike, what tends to happen is you kind of lose awareness of your mind. Your mind becomes neutral, but a good example is watching TV, because you just watch TV and that's it. The brain, your mind switches off and all your attention just follows the TV show. Of course, if it's an unhappy program, then it's going to make you a little bit unhappy, or if it's a happy program, it'll make you a bit happy. But generally speaking, when you watch TV, it's just kind of right? So, when we do meditation, usually we put the attention onto something that is fairly neutral in aspect. Not always, but usually we do that. So, for example, the breath is a good example of this. The breath is neither pleasant nor unpleasant. It's not nice, it's not bad. But when you focus onto it, what happens is your mind will start to become calm and neutral, just like the object you were looking at. So you start to feel a bit more happy and a bit more grounded, because the mind's in a fairly nice, neutral place. So, according to the commentaries on the suttas, when you place your mind onto a neutral object, neutral as in liking and disliking, if you don't know that you've done that, it will be counted as unpleasant. But if you know that you've done that, it will be counted as pleasant. So if your mind's just neutral, it's not particularly nice, it's not suffering. But if you have done it consciously, like putting your attention onto the breath, or onto a certain colour, or onto a certain meditation object, then that tends to be experienced as something fairly pleasant. And the more you concentrate your mind onto it, the more happy the mind starts to get. So, this what is the point or the benefit of being able to place your mind into a neutral area or a neutral zone? I heard this morning a good example of this, and we were talking in the coffee shop where I had to go because we have no electricity, so go and get my morning coffee. And the owner is a Muslim, and he's talking about fasting in Ramadan and how happy he feels when he's fasting and not eating. And most of us were in agreement that not eating is a fairly nice experience if you do it intentionally. If you're forced to not eat, then it's very unpleasant, right? I used to work in a restaurant, and there was one woman, they had to wait a long time for their table. They booked for 8 o'clock, and at 9 o'clock we still hadn't sat them. And this woman fainted from hunger, and they tried to sue the restaurant. Like, if you have to wait over an hour for your food, it's just too unbearable human suffering. I look forward to my fasting days. I like to not eat. I had a very small lunch, but I won't eat again until tomorrow lunchtime. So, because you're relating to it kind of deliberately, it's kind of interpreted as a pleasant experience. So there was an experiment done on children who were practicing fasting in Ramadan, and the test was, you've got to love psychologists, the test was they took 2 groups of children, stuck them each in a room. The one group of children had been fasting for Ramadan, and the other group of children were non-fasters. And in the room they put a big bowl of sweets, and they said to the kids, you're not allowed to touch the sweets. And then they left, and they had the cameras on, and they waited to see how long it was before the children started to take the sweets. That's why I say psychologists are very nice people who dream up these kind of experiments. So, as you might expect, the children that had practiced with fasting were much more able to resist taking the sweets than the children who hadn't practiced with fasting. So, by abstaining from food, it gives you the power over being controlled by food. But the same happens with the mind. If you're practicing meditation and you are accustomed to sitting without constantly thinking, dreaming things up, planning things, wanting things, doing things in your mind, and you're willing to stop the mind in a nice neutral space, what this does is it gives you an empowerment over your thinking. So that when thoughts do occur to you, you have much more choice whether you're going to follow those thoughts or not. And this is a big key part of meditation, or a key part of the results of meditation. It gives you a sense of empowerment over your own self and being. So next time you are talking to somebody and you don't like them and you're like, God, I wish they would shut up. You have that, if you're not mindful, you see, you start to latch onto that. Like, I don't like this person, I can't stand this person, when are we going to get away, I'm never going to talk. You can get caught up quite easily if you believe that initial thought. But if you practice this restraint and a thought comes up, you're like, hang on a minute, I don't want to follow that thought. I don't want to talk to this person thinking in my mind how much I dislike them. So, to be able to do this gives you a sense of empowerment over your own mind and your own thought, that you start to get some choice in the way that your thoughts are going to flow. And that's one of the advantages of doing the meditation. However, we do get this problem then, if you're sharp. What you've done is you've simply replaced one line of thinking or things that you can place your attention onto with something else, right? If you sit and you meditate on the breath, and you become quite serene or quite happy with the breath. It takes a bit of practice, but most people can get there. Haven't you just replaced all the crazy thoughts with something else, with the breath, right? So this is the problem that you're always going to have with meditation, and all teachers of enlightenment are going to have this problem. Because when they say, hey, I've attained to this enlightenment and it's really good, and you should do too, and when you experience it you'll know. So if you have some faith in what they've said, you sit and practice. And then you say, well, what do I do? Right, to the teacher. And the teacher can only tell you objects that you can place into the mind. They can say, well, think about fluffy kittens, they can think about fish and chips, you can think about England losing the World Cup to Croatia. That was a big relief. I was so happy when England lost to Croatia. If we hadn't lost to Croatia, we would lose to France, and that is unbearable. At least the Croatians now, yeah, we can cheer the Croatians on and hope that they win the World Cup. That would be neat. It's not been on yet, right? Has it happened yet? When is it? This soon?
I think Monday morning.
Monday morning, so it's okay. So, what you end up doing is you're replacing one object with another object in the mind. So instead of focusing on this, you're focusing on that. But remember what we started out with. Anything that you focus your mind onto, that's going to blossom up into an experience in the mind. But that's something that's just arisen. I'm doing your metta hands here. The Metta Centre. That's something that's just arisen, so no matter what pleasant experience or happy experience you can do, it's something that's come because you've placed your attention in a wise spot, and it's come up, and that's now your experience, and that experience is going to fold up and vanish. So there isn't anywhere left for you to place your mind, right? Because you can only place your mind onto certain things that you can hear, taste, smell, touch, or think up. Is there anywhere else you can place your mind? So enlightened teachers always have this difficulty that the only thing they can tell you to do is they can say, well, follow precepts. They can say, well, sit in meditation and don't move. They can say, well, imagine something nice in your mind or follow the breath, but they're always going to be telling you something that you have to do. And whatever you do, that's not going to be it, right? So this is the difficulty that all enlightened teachers are going to come to. And I like to follow Advaita, which is an Indian school of enlightenment. And in this particular school, there are quite a lot of enlightened people. But they have this big problem that they can't tell you how to get enlightened. I went to see one of these guys, his name was Papaji, 23 years ago. It was really hard. You had to fly to India and ask around and then get sent on wild goose chases, and eventually you'd find the guy. And he was a very nice Indian man, lived in Lucknow and in a little house. And they made a kind of centre for him. And every day they'd go to his house and ring his doorbell and ask him to come to the centre and teach. So he'd come and he'd read from a book for a couple of hours in this beautiful, patient voice. And then he would answer a few questions. He'd have to write the questions down and he'd answer a few questions. And then he'd go home. Most of us accept or trust that actually he's enlightened. In case you're writing the name down, Papaji or Punjaji. These days it's easy, you just go on YouTube. Like 23 years ago, you had to fly somewhere and get a visa and get bad stomachs and all kinds of things to find these people. But that was also, I have total trust that he was enlightened. But what can he do for me? You can't really do anything. You would say things like, I really want to give up myself, and he'll say, well, you don't have a self, so there's nothing to give up. And you're like, fine, but then what do I do? And he said, well, there's nothing to do. And you're like, well, fine, but I'm not enlightened. And so we always had this interaction with enlightened people that they just can't really help you very much. So this is the difference between an enlightened person and a Buddha, when we talked about 3 kinds of Buddha. A Buddha is one who is able to understand, articulate, inspire other people to be able to find the same thing that they have. One who is enlightened but is not able to do that is called a Pacceka Buddha, which also means accidental Buddha, right?
Silent Buddha?
Silent Buddha, Pacceka means accidental, right? What does Pacceka mean? Okay, I'm not sure.
Pacceka means who could not claim he is a Buddha, the silent.
Yeah, but what does the word Pacceka mean? It doesn't mean silent.
I don't know.
I think it means accidental, or by chance.
I don't know.
Point being, they've become enlightened not through listening to a teaching and following a teaching, but kind of they've chanced upon it themselves. And because of that, they're unable to articulate and explain to other people and encourage other people to make the same attainment. And that's why they're called silent Buddhas. They're not actually silent, they're just not able to teach. So, we always have this problem that how do you let people know about this amitta, the unconditioned state of mind, when the only thing that you can tell people to do is to switch one thing for another thing in your attention.
But would you say that's only in the initial stages?
Is that what?
That's only in the initial stages of the practice, that you require a mental object so that you can place your mind to it?
So, can you meditate without an object?
Yes.
And if you meditate without an object, where is your mind going?
You actually, well, it depends on which mind you're talking about.
Which mind? Your mind, presumably.
Then you'll just be observing just the thoughts that arise and disappears.
Okay. So, when you're observing the things that arise and disappear, that's still just objects of the mind.
Yeah.
This is why we're always in this trap. It's called dependent origination.
But then those thoughts that arises and disappears will also no longer be the objects that you need to observe.
And then what happens?
Then what happens?
If there's no objects left to observe, then what happens?
It's like walking into an empty room.
Walking into an empty room.
Yeah, it's like there's just nothing there that you need to observe.
Okay, and is that happy or unhappy?
It's past that joy. It's
Past happy
that
and unhappy.
happy and
Okay,
unhappy.
so
yeah,
good. So the process of the mind is the mind will always snake out to focus on something, because that's the way you've trained your mind since you were very young. So even if you disengage the mind, or disengage with mindfulness, so you're watching what happens, still the mind is always snaking out to pick up an object, one object after another object after another object. And you can withdraw the intention so that you're no longer intending the mind out to things. But what will happen is there's still one thought will come up and get your attention, then the ache in your knee will get your attention, and then the sound of somebody didn't turn off their phone at the back. So your attention is always going to be snaking out to pick something up as an object. And this was the process called dependent origination. So your attention will move around your experience. So our practice is one of interrupting this process of the mind going out to things. So when the mind does go out to a sound of a baby crying, you stop. You can even note hearing if you need to. And you pull your attention back. And then something occurs in your mind that you want to have dinner or lunch, or did you turn off the oven before you left? I have that thing you did tap off on the card. Like when I get off your train, I can never remember if I tapped off or not. And several times I've forgotten, so I know that Sometimes I don't. Bankstown is good because it forces you to tap off here, right? So then you would pull your mind back from that because you can feel the attention condensing around that idea. Pull the attention back. And keep pulling the attention back, and then you will, the first step is you snap into an observing mode, where you can see these things calling on your attention, but you're no longer reacting to it. Is the first step. Then, after that, there is the mind no longer goes out to anything, and the mind starts to become self-aware and bright and clear. Now there is a difficulty with this when you say like going into an empty room, because whatever the mind sees, it creates an object out of. So the second the mind becomes kind of clear and stops, it immediately makes an object out of that. And then you're looking at the emptiness. So it's always kind of one step behind of itself. But every so often, if you're able to do that even that emptiness or calmness will also collapse, and you just get self-aware. It's very bright, it's very clear, and the mind isn't moving out to anything. So this is the process that was described in the Pondering Tree Sutta. And here in this particular sutta, it's dependent origination, for those who know it. If you don't know what dependent origination is, don't worry, it doesn't matter. And what it says in this particular sutta, it says that the attention, I'm going to make sure that I get it right for you.
Pandit, what's the name of the sutta in Pali? I couldn't find it online.
No,
is there another name?
I can send it to you.
Okay.
So the Sutta was talking about how the mind will go out and pick up objects to look at. Something to see, smell, hear, taste, touch, think about. That the mind is always trying to pick something, and if you're not thinking about this, then you're thinking about something else. And all initial practices are practices of putting in positive things to look at rather than negative things to look at. So if you're very angry and annoyed, and you move the anger and annoyance and replace it with metta, since we're in the Metta Centre, then that's a better object, that's a better way to place your mind. The Buddha's description of this was like with furniture. And in the old days, because screws and metal was hard to come by, when they put a table together, what they do is they drill holes through the legs and through the top, and then they put in a peg. They hammer in a tight rod which would hold the two pieces of wood together. If you wanted to dismantle the furniture, what you have to do is remove that peg so that you can pull it apart. And to do that, what you do is you take a smaller peg and you knock the smaller peg on the bigger peg, and the bigger peg comes out, and then the smaller peg is also loose. So this is what the Buddha said was like replacing one object with another object in the mind. You take an unwholesome or an unhappy state of mind and you knock it out by putting in a wholesome or a happy state of mind. So that's replacing one object or the object of mind with a better object of mind. But as we discussed, that also isn't going to get you to enlightenment. So, he says, one who understands the way that experience arises when you place your attention onto something. That person is one who has started to understand Dharma. And then that person will not engage in an act of merit, will not engage in an act of demerit, and will not engage in an act that is stationary. Now this formula doesn't get commented on very often, but it makes it quite clear in my mind. An act of merit is something good that you can do. So if you put your mind onto universal loving kindness and metta, this is a meritorious act. The word merit means to brighten. It brightens you, it brightens others, it brightens both yourself and others. So if you put your mind onto something positive, that's going to make you very brighter, lighter, clearer. An act of demerit is one that makes you darker and duller, or makes others darker and duller, or makes both yourself and others darker and duller. So, if you put your mind onto something that you really dislike, that you really can't stand, your mind's going to start to take on that object too. My initial examples were fluffy kittens and Donald Trump, but you can choose your own examples. So that's an act of merit and an act of demerit. But the third part of this formula was an act that is stationary. So the Buddha is here saying one does not plan an act of merit, one does not plan an act of demerit, and one does not plan an action that is stationary. So the action that is stationary means when you're placing your mind onto a meditation object, and that meditation object may start to appear as very pleasant and happy, for example the breath, but what's happening is you've closed your mind down onto something and it's no longer moving. That will be experienced as happiness, but it's still just another object that you're putting your attention onto, right? You're always in this trap of not being able to get out of putting your attention onto objects. So, when we do meditations, initially what you are doing is putting your attention onto a particular object, your breath, very often, or a colour or an idea of some kind as your meditation object. But the best that you can attain to is to become stationary on that object. So in this sutta, this was the length and breadth of the sutta, the Buddha says, when you walk about according to the doctrine, according to having understood the doctrine, the teaching, you do not plan an act that is either meritorious, non-meritorious, or stationary. So where's left for the mind to go? This is, I like the Zen koan. What happens when you're sitting at the top of a 100-foot pole? Where do you go? You can't go forward, you can't go back, you can't go up, you can't go down. There's nowhere left for you to go. So this is what happens with the mind, is at that point it starts to collapse back in on itself. The mind becomes self-aware. It becomes very bright, very clear. This is very definitely an experience that you have, but it's an experience that is clearly not the mind going out, picking something up to consider and think about. This open, expansive, empty experiencing then is the thing that we are trying to maintain. Ultimately, I can't tell you because I'm not enlightened, but that's the way that we are going to practice, putting everything down until we can let the mind stop and just the mind returns to itself. There was a Zen-like Thai monk who would teach this, and he was asked to explain the Four Noble Truths. And he said the first Noble Truth is the mind going out to objects. The mind dwelling outside of itself with objects. The second Noble Truth was the mind going out to objects. The third Noble Truth, cessation of suffering, he said when the mind returns to the mind. And the fourth Noble Truth, the path leading to the cessation of suffering, was to bring the mind back to the mind. So this is our job, this is our task as meditators, is to bring the mind back to the mind and not get caught up in either good states, bad states, or stationary or states of stillness. States of stillness also are not it. Not planning, not willing, one grasps at nothing, and therefore one is not perturbed. And then one is parinibbana. which means enlightenment. Clear enough? Clear as mud? But we covered the ground. The confusion made my head spin round. Okay, so that's the Pondering Tree Sutta. It hinges around these three things. One does not plan or will or make an act that is meritorious, that is not meritorious, or that is stationary.
This is about a pathful cessation of suffering. And Mr. Peter Musfield, he wrote one book, The Divine of the Buddha.
Yes.
He tried to claim that there's something unclear, path is unclear. Like in Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha mentioned about the 10 Magga.
Yes.
He tried to focus at the later, the Brahmana people, Brahmin people, ideology, they cut the two Magga, the Sammayana, Sammabhimutti.
Mm.
So, how do you think about that? Actually, I used to live in 15 or 17 years in India. So, I also observed something about the radical group of the anti-Buddhists.
So the question is, a technical question. I'm not sure everybody else will follow this totally, but the traditional formulation of Buddhism is as an eightfold path. Samma Ditti, right view. Samma Sankappa, right thought or right intention. Samma... We did Sangappa, Samma Vaja, which is right speech, which is right action, Samma Ajiva, right livelihood, Samma Vayama, which is right effort, Samma Sati, right mindfulness, and Samma Samadhi, right concentration.
Sammayana, Sammabhimutti.
So, that was the eightfold path that's normally presented, but you also have in Buddhism a tenfold path. And if ever you want to play tricks on Buddhists, you say, yeah, I follow the tenfold path. And then they're like, no, it's eightfold path. You say, no, it's the tenfold path.
It's like something confused about the moksha and nibbana.
Okay. Well, that's another question. So, there is actually a few suttas where instead of having this 8-part series, actually there's a 10-part series. So you want to play jokes on Buddhists, especially Buddhist monks, you say, I follow the tenfold path. And after right concentration was Samma Jnana, which is right knowledge, right knowing, and Samma Vimutti, right. Vimutti is considered equivalent to moksha, right. So Vimutti is liberation, and so yes, he's bringing up a particular scholar who likes to mention this to people, because it makes him one up on everyone else, you see, because he says, well, I have the tenfold path, you only have the eightfold path.
Yeah,
but to say that later people cut the last two parts of the path off it's a bit disingenuous. All of the teachings, like my thesis was done on dependent origination, and usually there are 12 links. But when I looked at the suttas, sometimes there's 8, sometimes there's 10, sometimes there's 16, sometimes there's 5. Often the links can switch position, and this link here appears way down the list there, and can switch around. So these were descriptions, they weren't exact formulas that are like A, B, C, D. You can also have A, D, E, C. I mean, it also works. So why not have some of the formulas would have 10 links, some of the formulas would have 8 links. I see no reason why we can't consider both to be original Buddhism. Now, is your question on what is Vimutti? Panya Vimutti and enlightenment through three kinds of vimutti, right? Panya, wisdom, liberation through wisdom, liberation through Gaya, right? Seeing the body, and then both ways liberated. My interpretation of this is vimutti is the attainment to enlightenment, but it's temporary. You're not yet an arahant. So I think vimutti is the experience first. In Zen they call it satori, that you have an experience of enlightenment, but you're not yet an arahant. Yeah. That's my understanding.
But the Samma Samadhi, like in Rishi Alarka Ramaputra Uruddha, at that time also they have the Samma Samadhi.
Well, they have samadhi. Is it samma?
Not Samma Samadhi at that time.
Well, do you call it samma?
Like a 5 ascetic, they led to the Buddha from
I'm not sure how much you guys are following this, but...
So samma usually is described as right, or translated as right, or skillful, wholesome.
Yeah. Like 5 ascetic, they led to the Buddha.
Sure. Well, so the thing is with concentration is, in this sutta, is making the mind stationary. So when you have concentration, you're simply focusing the mind onto an object. And it can make you happy or unhappy. If you get very refined, you'll get very refined states, psychic powers, all sorts. But you've still just replaced one object with another object. So the concentration is not going to get you enlightenment.
Yes,
so you need the vimutti as well.
Yeah, I have just is a theoretical question, but I have now practical question. When I was like 14 years old, I did a 10-day meditation. It's quite very good. I can concentrate my mind when I was 14, like class 9 or 10.
Okay.
And during like the study period, I gave my meditation in India. So even though I think also you also there in the Chonburi, 1 month meditation by Mahachula.
Right.
For master degree student. At that time I had like the 5 hindrances, it's very difficult. We'll do 1 month meditation. And I used to use one dead body on my behind under the tree. I keep with me.
Okay. And using a dead body as a meditation object is a tradition, because you might think he's a bit weird. It's actually a traditional Buddhist meditation object, and so you contemplate dead or dying bodies as a way to kind of break your attachment to your own self, to your own physical self, and to be able to put your mind onto the...
Ajahn told me that is not a vipassana. And I interviewed with him in Thailand.
Okay.
He followed the Mahasi. And when I came in Australia, I just started to practice meditation, Blue Mountain, about Gwenka. So what happened? In the 10th day, I could not concentrate my mind. So in like a 5 day, so I have a lot of pain in my body. Then my mind became calm and something. After 10 days, again wondering. So this is my problem. So how can I finally concentrate my mind? So there's just Visuddhi Magga Pukasa Sita Samadhi Panya. But now I have a very problem about the practice meditation. Even I cannot control sometimes. After 10 days, again wandering. So how can develop?
We're always going to have more and more problems, difficulties with meditation until you get enlightened. So the task is not to think about how can I solve the problem so that I can do meditation. You're always going to have more and more problems and difficulties as you get through the practice. In terms of dealing with the physical pain, you know the mechanisms to do that, right? You know.
Yeah.
Okay. So your difficulties with the wandering mind.
Yeah.
The reason, what I was talking about today is I'm showing you this threefold formula that isn't very often mentioned. That is, making the mind meritorious, demeritorious, or stationary. And usually you don't hear that in Buddhist circles, which is why I thought it was an interesting sutta to bring up here. When you concentrate the mind, then you're making the mind stationary, and it can become very happy and pleasant, and you can forget about your aching body, and then you think, oh, my meditation's going better. But you're going to have to come out of that concentration, and then you're back with the aching body again, right? So, many people say, don't practice concentration. As he said, Alara Kalama was not getting enlightened, although he could do concentration. But the Buddha continually recommended to concentrate, right? Every sutta after sutta after sutta, he says, do jhana meditation, concentrate your mind. But what happens is, if you concentrate your mind very well, until you become very happy, very one-pointed, becomes quite serene, the breath becomes very serene, or it can be like entering a nice empty room, but is emptiness, it's not fullness. You have to wait for that emptiness to also collapse. What you should do is, as you come out of that concentration, you pay very close mindfulness. And when you come out of the concentration, because it's been reasonably happy, as you come out, suddenly you have that moment where the mind is just clear, bright, it's no longer concentrated on anything, but it's no longer going out to anything. And that's the state of mind that's important. So that's the way Sariputta became enlightened. He practiced concentration meditation, and he went in and out and in and out and in and out. And as he comes out of concentration, he watches how the mind starts to attach to objects, and suffering arises, then he'd go back into concentration. So it's through watching that process of how the mind grasps onto things that he became enlightened. But this is just our job and our task, and every meditation teacher has a different story,
yes, my
a
teacher,
different presentation.
My teacher in Bangkok, he told me, he tried to teach people, the meditation is the every moment. No need to go for 10 days or 1 month. It's whatever you have a phenomenon, a feeling, or sensation, just you know the daily life, the every time.
Trouble is with just knowing the sensation is you're still not going to get enlightened, because the mind's still going out to objects.
Yes,
when you do that.
Modern time is very difficult to apply the meditation in every moment, you know, because in the Buddha's time or now quite different.
Are you sure?
Yeah, it's quite different.
I'm not sure about that.
Same difficulty.
I read this great description of this spiritual teacher, and she said, all the people in this modern era with all their newfangled gadgets that they can't let go of, they have no time for understanding God. And this was Saint Teresa of Avila writing in 1580. So I don't think it's changed for people now with all your newfangled gadgets. You've got no time for God. It's the same thing. I'm not so sure that things are different for us now. But one thing that is different is the charisma. And that was what Peter Maysfield was actually writing about in his book. If you're sat in front of the Buddha, your mind state will be different. You'll be like, you're not going to be thinking about things, right? If you're sat in front of somebody you've never heard of before, never seen before, how long is he going to keep talking? Might say the exact same thing. So I think that's different from our age now to the age of the Buddha, the personal charisma of the Buddha. And that was the thesis of Peter Maysfield, was saying that the Eightfold Path is transmitted from an arahant to a person. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I was born Buddhist, so kind of I find that as people progress in the path of Buddhism, that suffering becomes a very important factor. And I'm just wondering, I mean, if you're Arahat, I mean, you surely can still see, taste good food and not too tasty food. I mean, is it that we should understand that happiness or whatever it is, it's not permanent, it's fleeting, but in that sense of fleeting happiness, you can still get some enjoyment out of it, and then not, completely dismiss that there are present experiences in life. Do you think sometimes we are throwing the baby with the bathwater in focusing on suffering and almost feeling guilty to say that it's good food or nice experience?
It's a question of whether if you're trying to understand the enlightened mind, like how does a fully enlightened person relate to food? Can you give them the most wonderful, perfect piece of Vegemite on toast and they just feel nothing?
Yeah.
Seems unlikely, doesn't it? But that's what we are presented with in terms of enlightened people. Buddha said in understanding the enlightenment is imponderable. So your head will crack into 7 pieces before you can understand what it's like. So I don't know about that. How can you answer how that is felt? Interesting, in this sutta it says that when one becomes enlightened, one still experiences the Vedana, the liking and the disliking, but that the Vedana does not generate any attachment. So it's just liking and disliking appears, but doesn't go on to create any suffering.
And would you say that the path, as you said earlier, it's focused on suffering? Would you say that's not really the path? The path is not one of suffering, the path is one of happiness. It is a joyous path.
Yeah. Well, I think as wisdom grows, your happiness should increase.
Absolutely.
Isn't it? I mean, otherwise, what's the whole point of the whole exercise?
Yeah.
I mean,
it's not to make you more happy.
But at least peaceful and less, dissatisfied, because it's really ignorance that we're trying to get rid of, isn't it? I mean, if you can understand the things. I mean, I always say that when people say, there's no happiness, there's no lasting, it's just a transitory nature of things that you understand. But in that, once you understand that, surely you can enjoy the moment. Is there anything wrong in that? I mean, I think, you know what I'm trying to say, sometimes it's almost like you feel you're deluded, even if you say that I'm enjoying this food or whatever. I mean, it's just, but I mean, you're not going to crave for it. Yeah. But why in that particular moment, understanding that it's going to end, you can still enjoy it.
Well, I still enjoy my fish and chips.
Exactly. Yeah. Would you still enjoy it, your Arahat?
I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah, but you met enlightened people. But
well, this Papaji, I wouldn't say I met him, but I saw him.
Yeah.
One thing that I really liked about him was every day they'd go and take him to the centre and he would read from this book and answer questions, but not if the cricket was on. That's true. So they're ringing his doorbell and he's like, I'm watching the cricket today. And he's enlightened, so I like that idea that he's enlightened but he's enjoying the cricket.
Yeah.
So to me that makes sense and I'm happy with that. But we can only speculate on what the fully enlightened mind is like. But you do get these experiences, the moments when the mind does collapse and it starts to become self-aware and it's bright and it's clear. And when you get that, you're like, oh, that's it. Nisargadatta would say it was like remembering. He said, you're just like, oh, that's right. It's not like a great thing that happens, it's just like, oh, yeah, somehow I'd forgotten that.
There's no fireworks or anything.
Right. That's why they say usually you laugh for a very long time because it was all just so stupid in the first place. But then people argue against that and say you can't say there's no suffering in the world and it's all stupid. And it depends which standpoint you're coming from. You might look up Muji. He's one of these enlightened people. Again though, he can't really explain a path. Have anybody watched Muji? M-O-O-J-I. He's a Jamaican. So he's, as far as we can tell, he's enlightened. Look up Muji laughing, it's wonderful. Because he finds everything kind of funny, even people suffering he kind of finds happy. So his meetings are very joyous occasions. My complaint is he doesn't have any path, he gets confused over this thing. The only thing you can tell somebody to do is to put your mind onto a different object. You can switch one thing for another thing, but they can't tell you how to get out of that process. And that was where the Buddha was so good in his teaching, was he would show people how to break the process. So yeah, I think the more you live in line with Dharma, the happier you should feel. But the happiness is I don't like the word happiness, because happiness is when England win the World Cup. You're like, well, is that happiness or not? Do I rename that and say that's excitement, not real happiness? Do I? So personally, I don't like that word, happiness. To me, there's a feeling of rightness, like this is the proper way that things should go. There's a feeling of confidence that arises. To me, those are better words than happiness when I compare happiness between things.
And it's
they do say that your happiness is increased if you're married. I'm not sure if that's true or not. But the happiness tests that psychologists do to see what makes you happy and keeps you happy, the research shows that generally speaking you have a level of happiness and it doesn't matter what happens to you. You win the lottery, you're just happy for a little while, then you're back to where you were. You lose your legs in an accident and it'll make you unhappy for a while, but you'll soon come back. Some people's happiness bar is fairly good, some people's happiness bar is quite low. I think English, we like a low, we like some misery, we like there, but other people, they're it's called a set point, or the point that you would tend to gravitate to. And the funny thing is, it doesn't matter too much what happens to you, you still end up coming back to that more or less point, depending if you're a happy person or a depressive person. But some things that helped raise that general bar was, the major things were being married, helps, apparently. I'm a little unconvinced. I shouldn't say that, you're getting married.
I'll tell you soon.
Yes. Being part of a religious group and having a wide circle of friends tended to be the things that lifted you up. And there's some discussion that being part of a religious group, it didn't matter which religion, there was some discussion that may actually just be having a wider circle of friends, because you're part of a group. So these kind of investigations into happiness, I don't think they're like a spiritual happiness. Yeah. You can get happy watching Star Wars. Did you watch The Force Awakens? Nobody? Oh, okay. It wasn't The Force, the new one, I can't remember now. But is that happiness or is that excitement? I don't know. The happiness that comes from meditation is a stability, because you start to get that choice.
One thing you pointed out is that a lot of the meditation practices do seem to be about adopting a particular object and doing so deliberately, which has its wholesome consequences. Yeah. But it seems that ultimately we're aiming for a stage where the mind is no longer going towards objects at all.
Correct.
So my question is that a transition which we should be deliberately prompting in some way, that we should be deliberately dropping the object at some stage, or is it just a natural transition?
Well, both, but I started out by talking about these Pacceka Buddhas, accidental Buddhas. If you're going to come across it accidentally, as just some kind of natural occurrence, I mean, you're going to be very lucky or have a lot of lifetimes before you do that. So you have to engage in a practice. Some schools, especially Advaita, they say, well, it all happens when you're ready for it. And you're like, well, what do you do in the meantime? You're like, well, eat, drink, be merry, free sex, have drugs. And they say that you stop doing those things when you've worn it out, when you've come to the end of it. But that's not my experience. That you don't. I see people who drink, very rarely do they come to the end of it. There has to be a point where you take charge and stop it. Right? Underneath my building in Bangkok, there's a AA. They come and practice stopping alcohol. They have to make a conscious effort and a will. It doesn't just like, oh, I'm not going to do it anymore. So I think you have to develop practice. Yeah. But that practice is one of not attaching to things. So we're continually not attaching to things. But the reason I like to talk about this is because when the mind certain points, when you're not attaching to things, at certain points the mind suddenly becomes self-aware and becomes very bright and very clear. But the first thing that you do when that happens is you bring something into it. Oh, is this emptiness, or is this happiness, or is this... You immediately make it into an object. Also, very many meditating teachers tell you to dismiss any experience that you have. Right? But actually there's a certain experience that is the right experience, and that one we can hold on to when the mind's not going out to anything, and you're like, oh, suddenly it's back, it's here, it's clear. You're like, okay, that's what I need to do. And that's definitely something that you can practice and cultivate. Yeah.
So assuming that we're committed to a practice of, say, meditation on the breath, given object. Is that the deliberate practice you're talking about, which then transitions into that self-aware state? Or is there an additional practice of shifting from the, say, meditation on the breath into the self-aware state?
Yes, there's a shift. And the word is godrapu. And godrapu, they translate as change of lineage in the translations. It actually means a quantum leap. And quantum leap means a change from one state to another. You know, an electron, as it flies around an atom, and if you heat it up, it jumps to another orbit. But there's no in-between stage. It's either in this state or that state. There's no in-between. So that's what the meaning of the word godrapu is. And there's a jump, and there's a clear, definite change of state of being. So yes, when you're using the breath and things as a meditation object, you can do it in two ways. One is to use it to clamp your attention down till it stops and you get very peaceful. But then you need to watch as your mind comes out of concentration and goes back in. And it's the mind coming out of concentration that you watch this process of picking up objects of a consciousness. The other way to use the breath or something is just as something to hold on to while you get yourself steady. Because if you say, well, don't do anything, you say to your mind, right, don't do anything. It can't. It's karma, its nature is to pick up things to look at and feel and think about. So it doesn't know how to just stop still and be with itself. So you need an object just to hold on to while you do that. But your object should get less and less important. So you can give up the breath. If you know it, just mindful and not mindful, that's actually all you need to really know. But it's difficult, so we use the breath, or we use the stomach, or use lights or something. Yeah.
Just talking of mindfulness, I mean, obviously bring your mind to a peaceful state. Is there another, do you use the mind to gain insights as well? Like, because in Buddhism there seems to be two types of samatha and vipassana. I mean, is that one and the same, or is it a deliberate directing the mind once it's focused to see through things?
I tend to avoid this question because it comes up a lot and people have so many trained answers to it. And very often I hear teachers answering that question and it feels like they're answering from a trained script, almost. But insights are not the goal. The insights are for a reason. So you need to know what that reason is for. And I know a lot of so-called insight meditators who are always getting insights into things. But the insight is for a reason, and the reason is so that you can go back to the mind just knowing the mind. It's so that you can let go of stuff. So for example, somebody accuses you of something that you didn't do. Right? Your boss says to you, you stole from our petty cash and you're fired. That's a pretty heavy thing if you didn't do it. Right? It's going to play on your mind. And playing on your mind means when that object comes into your attention, you just can't stop yourself from thinking about it. Because it's not fair, they shouldn't have said that. Well, who did steal it? Maybe I could set up a camera and find the person who did steal it. This happened to me once. I worked in a hotel and they accused me of giving away free drinks because the alcohol levels were not matching what was recorded on the cash register. So I went back 6 months after I left and I said, look, have all your levels come right now? And he was like, well, it's all a bit weird. I'm like, you need to just admit to me that that wasn't me, because you've still got the same problem. Anyway, I never got resolution with that. Something like that comes up, you really want to think about it, right? That's a tough thing to just say. You can't just let that wash over you. France or Croatia win the World Cup on Monday, that you can wash over you. That you don't need to think about, right? It's easy to drop that, unless you're a football fanatic. So the insights are there in order for you to be able to learn, to be able to drop objects of the mind. The more obsessive the things are that you put your attention onto, the more you're always going to be caught up in thinking about things, doing things, wanting things, changing things, growing things, making things, building houses, planting gardens, buying new cars, setting up a business. I mean, there will not be an end to it. Right? So our insight is in order to be able to let go of those objects. So you see something come up in your mind and you say, well, I know I was accused of that thing I didn't do, but I need to get insight into that feeling. When you get insight into the feeling, then you can let it go. Hopefully.
Yes, just a question. Yeah, just one this is my PhD topic. What I am doing now, the Buddhist education.
Yes.
Sometimes, I'm confused about like someone say Four Noble Truth, the main teaching of the Buddha, or Eight Noble Path. Someone say cause and effect, 46 Samsara, and someone say Tilakkhana. So confused. So what do you mean, sir? Which one is the main teaching of the Buddha? Just I want to be clarified on my.
I don't think you can say which one is the main teaching. I mean, there are all skillful things to use at the right time. If you're building a house and you've got a drill, a hammer and a saw, you're going to use different ones at different times. I can't say the hammer is king, the saw. People who use the saw, they're not. I mean,
one is the main teaching of the Buddha.
Well, if you have one, I just say the amata, deathless.
Yeah, especially
that's the teaching.
I disagree with the commentary. The Buddha was I don't like it. Especially you can see the Swakato Bhagavata Dhammo, Sandiptiko, Akaliko, Ehipachiko. The Buddha said, come and see, not come and believe, So other religion they say come and believe, but Buddha didn't say. But when we practically see some later the texts that indirectly show the come and believe. The Sila Samadhi. Sila is like in the Indian word.
Yeah.
Sila like a stone,
Sure.
Very heavy. So how can he see the comment? Because he already have a burden, with a stone, like a Sila. So I became a monk 14 years old. I don't know many things. So that's why I have my thesis. I want to know about that. So
yeah, I don't know which is the most important teaching. I would just say amata, deathless. That there is enlightenment. That to me is in.
Like Pabbajya Sutta, Buddha says, Sangbado yang haravaso, Pabbajya tanaiti, Ammukaso Pabbajya iti diswana Pabbajya. The Sangbado yang haravaso, when he see the dirtyful life, the tricky life, being houseful life, and he see the pure sky like that, without cloud, and that became going forth for...
You realise you've confused everybody.
Yeah.
Venables, would you say that actually they're all within each other? So within Four Noble Truths you have the deathless, within Four
my
Noble
question
Truths you
is
have
like
the
this.
origination.
I want to say, like, why like this many Theravada country, especially, if really they understand that main teaching of the Buddha, how can they again go to the household life? This is my question on my...
Then you should all become monks.
Yeah, that is so.
Yeah.
Like
I have a razor blade in here. Are you ready?
That's why I'm writing. So how can we, again, when you see the Four Noble Truths, so how can they again go back to that kinds of life? Yes, this is my main interpretation on my thesis.
I can tell you a story, because I can't answer your question, but I can tell you a story. We monks like to swap these stories a lot.
Yeah.
There's one monk who, he went and got, he was a monk from a very early age, 20 I think it was, and he was a monk for 16 years, and then he was travelling through Kazakhstan, and he met a Kazakhstani woman, and so he disrobed and got married to the Kazakhstani woman. And 9 months later, he was back in Thailand, reordaining as a monk again. So we like to swap these stories because it gives us encouragement that you stay as a monk.
No, that's like...
But I don't know if you know, if you disrobe and then you reordain, you've lost all your status. You have to go back to the bottom of the pile and start at one again. So you lost. So we like those kind of stories. I don't know how, I can't answer that question. How, if you understood Buddhism, how could you go back to lay life? I'm not sure that monks particularly progress faster than lay people. I think it depends on the karma a lot. But who knows? We didn't confuse you at all today? A little bit?
I'm feeling very, much more knowledgeable than I was before I came.
You know, sometimes we pick topics, so and when we're talking about coming here, we have to pick topics up. So I picked topics from something that I've done recently. And I particularly liked this threefold formula because it's not something you hear very often in Buddhism. Action of merit, action of demerit, and action that's stationary. And it's a little confusing until you pull it apart. But once you pull it apart, it's quite clear, I think. It's a nice, straightforward formula.
Mate, I have a curious question. The sutta is called the Pondering Tree Sutta.
I actually think there's the section of suttas is called the tree section.
Ah, yes, I've seen
And
that.
this is the pondering one in the
Right.
tree section.
I was wondering where the tree came from.
Yeah, it's the set. They're all tree suttas.
Okay. Do they use tree as an analogy?
Or it might be all pondering suttas. I'll have to send you the thing. I can't remember which
Okay.
way round it is.
I know that there is a set of suttas about trees. Okay.
I'll send you the link.
Great,
In fact, I
thank
have
you.
it on my phone.
Yep, I'll share it with everyone as well.
It's actually about dependent origination, which is this process where the mind pulls something into attention and then you get this fireworks show of liking and disliking, getting attached, suffering over things. Well, what happens if your mind doesn't go out to anything? That's our job and our task.